This is the Troutbitten podcast.
Troutbitten.
Troutbitten?
Troutbitten.
Troutbitten.
Troutbitten?
Yeah, Troutbitten.
Troutbitten.
It's about trout.
Wild trout. This is Troutbitten.
This is the Troutbitten podcast. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Dominic Swentowski. I'm the owner of Troutbitten and the author of troutbitten.com. All right, friends, welcome back. This is episode 4 of season 11, and our topic is emergers. The Troutbitten crew is here with me this evening, and we want to talk through one of the most enigmatic patterns in fly fishing. We hear it a lot, fish emergers, because they're problem solvers. Are trout being picky up top? Fish emergers. Are trout swirling underneath? Fish emergers. Before the hatch really kicks off, maybe fish emergers. Even during a heavy hatch, go ahead and fish emergers. Sometimes all of this is great advice, too. For many anglers, emergers have seemingly become the go-to solution when the fishing gets tough. And the common refrain to fish emergers has a lot of merit. But like most things in fly fishing, this topic is not so simple. Because emergers can be fished on the surface, in the surface film, or a few inches underneath, or all the way through the water column. And they're quite productive in all of those zones, given the right situation. So there are a few different kinds of emergers, really. That's because there are 3 places to fish them. Up top as a floating dry fly emerger, just under the surface or in the film, and then somewhere in the middle of the water column, again, underneath. So tonight, we'll talk about the flies themselves. But far more important, I think, is how we fish these flies, where and when we fish them, and perhaps the most important question of all, why fish an emerger? I have a sense that this will be another in-depth podcast where we still don't cover everything that we'd like to. This could probably be broken down into a multi-part skills series like we've done with other topics, but let's get this opening discussion on the table. What's the deal with emergers? So before we dig into our topic, let me introduce the guys and then answer a couple listener questions. So gentlemen, identify yourselves. I had an idea. Here is Dr. Trevor Smith.
Howdy.
Right, and here's my idea. What's one non-fly fishing specific tool that you carry on the water every day? Like something you don't buy in a fly shop, really, but you use for fishing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have night eyes gear ties in most of my packs.
Good answer.
Fishing and hunting. Just because I don't know if you guys have probably seen them before, but they're little like rubberized, like twisties, basically.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Nice for holding rods together, nice for like holding a pack together if it breaks.
All right, that's not a bad idea. Anybody else use those?
No.
Not really. I use zip ties for all kinds of things, but I don't use
Josh,
those much.
what do you have? Same question to you then, Josh. What do you use out there that you don't really buy in a fly shop?
There's a couple things similar to Trevor. I use not night eyes, not those gear ties, but I use zip ties for everything. I mean, I connect a bunch of stuff with zip ties, and if it causes a problem, then I'll wrap tape around the zip tie to keep it from like puncturing the waders and stuff.
I love it.
Because I've had that happen. I've had zip tie ends put holes in my waders before.
Do you find a quality difference in the zip ties? I keep having mine break this year. It's like a new batch of zip ties. Whatever.
Really?
I bought the new ones at Home Depot.
The bag that I have is like 300. I've not bought them in years. Yeah,
I need some of yours.
Yeah.
I'll pay you 3 cents each.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
Do you carry zip ties in your waders? Do you carry them in your vest or somewhere so that you have them readily
I always
available
have
while
like
you're fishing?
7 or 8 of them in the back of my
No kidding.
vest. Yeah,
Yep.
I just use
I
them for
sometimes
everything.
have a couple.
Mm-hmm. The one other thing that's kind of silly, but in the winter has been nice because I make more mistakes with my fingers in the winter, and I think I've told you about this, but I use it's like a jeweler's tool. It's a little it's a rubber handle like that, and it's got a pretty strong magnet at the end of it, and it's telescopic. It expands to about 3 feet, and I pick up stuff like all the time with that. I'll drop like flies in the water, and I don't have to grab them.
Flies make sense.
Yeah, I'll drop things in the water, and I can just reach down and get it. It's been like if I'll drop, I don't know, my forceps in the water, and you just reach down and get it, and you don't have to get your hands wet and cold.
Josh Darling of Wilds Media is an idea man.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Deli? What do you have? Bill Dell.
The only thing I can think of is the fish whistle, the remote shutter that I use for my camera.
That's true. Yeah,
The fish
people call it a
whistle.
fish whistle because you hold the remote shutter in your mouth.
Yeah.
I thought you had like a subsonic whistle that called all the fish in.
We all call us.
It would explain so much.
Yeah.
It works for both, It's
Like
got a
like Link in Legend of Zelda.
That's right.
yeah. The one side takes pictures, you blow into the other side, and the fish come running, and then they kind of support each other.
Definitely.
All right. What about you, Matt Grobe? Montana Matt, Pittsburgh Matt.
I'm pretty boring.
Mm-mm.
The only thing I could think of, and I literally looked at my vest, is my clicker, and I'm sad to say that.
Yeah.
Just got the old clicker, man.
It's not a one-number clicker, though, isn't it? Doesn't it have 3?
It's a 3-number clicker, man.
Yeah.
It's the clicker of all clickers.
Tell them why.
Bill, don't lie. Bill Dell has his clicker. Same thing.
Yeah, mine's a 4-digit clicker.
Yours
it's
is
ready.
digital, though, and we've been through this. You can't.
No, the digital one kept shorting out after rains, so I went back to the old school.
Well, I
You
trust
got to
that.
hear. It's that noise, it motivates you to catch the next
It's
fish.
gotten to a point where now my nickname is Numbers, but
Numbers.
I walk around just to purposely walk behind my buddy fishing and go
And click it.
tick, 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 tick. Right? Or
I love it.
it's the most obnoxious thing
Hey, tell everybody why there's 3 numbers on it, though.
for Frank Naylor numbers. What do you mean?
Well, no, I mean, because you're counting brown trout, rainbow trout, and what, cuties?
No, not the old one. That might have been the nap I was using back in the
Yeah,
day.
you
But
were
now
using
I'm
a nap.
just back to the old freaking clicker that like your high school
The chrome
track
one,
coach
yeah.
would hit.
Just the
Yeah.
one number. Oh, I thought you had 3. I thought you still had the 3.
It has 3. You can get up to triple digits.
999,
But I don't
yeah.
think you can do 1,000.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Now we're on.
Oh.
So, yeah, you can get up to 999.
But if you ever want to annoy your buddy fishing, just walk right behind him. How was it? Click, 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 click. I'm going upstream.
I got an upgraded model that you can get to 1,000. You can get to 9,900, and yeah.
The ongoing clicker. Anyway, that's all I could think of.
All right.
I need to get zip ties, I guess. I'm missing out.
Yeah.
I use alligator clips. That's mine.
Hmm.
You guys know what those are?
The Dorsey, right?
Yeah, I hang my Dorsey on my Dorsey or an indicator on the alligator clip. I use it for a couple of other things to just hold line and stuff once in a while. It's what? It's from it's like an electronics. Trevor, what's the alligator clip from?
Gosh, I don't know.
No?
No.
You buy them in Radio Shack, like when Radio Shack used to exist, right? That's the last big pack I got of them. Anyway, like if you're making transistor radio for
Yeah,
yourself,
it's usually
you
for
might
like
use
testing cables and stuff, right?
Yeah, sure, I think so.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's that. Let's do a couple questions because we really haven't done them yet. This first one's really, well, it was going to be a question, but here's a comment. So in episode 2 of this season, I said that if you waited until retirement age to start fishing, then you've waited too long. That's what I said. I stand behind that. That reality hit a couple of people a little too hard, and I received a few kind of frustrated responses since then. Each message that I received was about the same. Each person told me that they are older, they have just started fishing, and they're having a great time and learning a lot of things. To that, I say, fantastic, good for you. I mean it. Awesome. I hope you keep having a great time. And I never said otherwise. Yes, you can go out there, have a great time, and learn things, no matter when you pick up fishing. What I said needs the context of the full conversation, so go back and listen to it. I've also said the same thing at least a couple of other times in the years we've been doing this podcast. I've written it on the website, and I've said it in presentations. And I mean it. If you wait until you are 70 years old to start fishing, you cannot learn everything you'll want to learn to be an accomplished angler. And that's the damn truth. Some people may not like to hear it, but it's a fact. Like, compare this to anything else, and you'll be faced with reality. Imagine learning to play guitar at 70, starting to learn guitar at 70, starting to learn tennis, starting to learn golf, or most any other skill, cooking, I don't know, almost anything. You can only get so far. Like, absolutely, you can learn things. You can have a lot of fun playing the guitar or improving your putting game. But with limited time, you'll never get as far with the discipline. You'll never get as far with that activity as if you had started at 20 years old, right? It's undeniable. It's just a fact. So fishing is the same, and it really is. It's one of those things where the more you learn about it, the more you realize how much you still have to learn. That's how I felt about guitar. And time on the water is the only real teacher. We say this all the time. And our time, everybody's time is limited. Even if you're retirement age, your time is still limited. And really, remember, the topic for the for that podcast was the stages of an angler. And the truth is, if you start fishing late in life, you don't have a lot of time for all of those stages. You can go through those stages. My comment then, that you're too late, is really meant to inspire anyone out there who's listening or who was listening, who's thinking about really dedicating some time to fishing. And I'm saying, don't wait. Like, do it now, and you won't regret that decision. That's really who the comment's for. And I wanted to speak that because I did. I got a few emails, and when I get those that are so similar, and I know it kind of touched a nerve, then I know perhaps too I could communicate it better. I know sometimes I speak very like direct, and I say, "Hey, you're too late." I still mean it, but there now I kind of possibly put a few more things behind it. You guys have thoughts on that?
The great Warren Miller once said, "If you don't do it this year, you'll be 1 year older when you do."
There you go.
It's one of my favorite quotes, right? And it's very true. And I think we weren't saying, all for having fun, right? But I think you explained it really well, Dom, in the fact that if you try anything when you're 70 up against the knowledge of someone that's done it since they were 12 or 15, you can't compare that. That's all we're saying, right? So it benefits one to get out. Now, if you are 70, like you said, great. Right? I mean, if you're enjoying it, at the end of the day, that's all that matters. But what we're saying is, the accumulation of knowledge through a lifetime of fishing is untouchable. That's all.
So I hope people out there that are 20 and listening, don't wait. Or if you're 30 or 40 and life is really, really busy, don't say to yourself, well, I'll get to fishing when I'm retired. If you really want to get somewhere with it, well, you can get somewhere. But if you really want to, if you have any time at all, get to it. Get to it now. And like you said, man, that's the same for anything.
I got a comment. I guess I'll contradict you.
Go ahead.
You talk about retirement and you talk about the age of 70. And I think those are two different categories. I think, let's say you retire at 55 or at 60 or maybe even 70. Let's think of the bigger picture. Let's say you have a 10-year window to learn fishing. And at the point you're retired, you don't have a job and you most likely don't have as many responsibilities, maybe. And so maybe that allows you to fish 200, maybe 250 days a year. So with that ability to do that, I think you can quickly bridge that knowledge gap, especially with all the information, whether it be Troutbitten, whether it be many of the books or many of the different resources that are out there today. I think the information is highly available. And so yes, you may not have grown up on the river. You may not have had that, but I think the ability to become, let's say you're in your 20s, right? Maybe you're only fishing 50, 60 days a year, or even less than that. I guess what I'm saying is if you're retired and you can spend the time to spend 200 to 250 days a year, I think you then have the ability to quickly pick that up, because at that point, your 1 or 2 years equal maybe 4 or 5 years of the person that didn't have the opportunity to spend all that time on the river.
But if you add those two things up, then that's like your actual potential. Like if you,
that's a good way to put it.
Like if you were first, if you started at 20 and you put in 50 days a year for 45 years, and then you get to 65, retire, and jump up to 200 days a year, that's a whole lot more potential than if you don't do anything.
It is.
And you've got like all that muscle memory for years, all those muscles built up to wade that you would never have built up. There's a lot of things that you miss out on, even if you could become a better angler.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you look at mastery in any type of hobby or sport, I mean, I don't know any mastery that occurs like even with golf, right? Nobody comes out of retirement in football or hockey or baseball, or when they're that old, or a doctor doesn't start studying to be a doctor. Like you could cook hamburgers.
Yeah. Human plasticity, like mental plasticity peaks much younger than that. So, I mean, I think Grobe is right about that. And I also think river hours do have a direct correlation, right? Yeah. So we're all talking about like just a straight age. And so I agree with Bill on one hand that river hours make a difference. But I think with river, like Josh said, kind of to bring both points together, your age when you begin times the number of river hours with some sort of equation that accounts for the fact that your mental plasticity and learning is best in younger years, you're going to, your optimal outcome is you start early and get hard.
I'm going to get emails about mental plasticity.
Yeah. Maybe those guys are taking Ginkgo biloba and reading those fly fishing books.
People are going to tell me my mind is plastic.
Plus, how many anglers at 70 can wade?
Right.
There's
a lot to it. Yeah.
There's a lot that can. Sure, certainly. I'm going to get some negative comments on this.
See what I mean?
But,
I think it's just what level we're talking about, right? I think to Bill's point, you can get to a spot where you're, we're not saying you can't become a good angler, right? There's just no.
You can become a great angler. Yeah.
50 years of experience. I don't see the equivalent, because when your experience when you're 20 to 30, I think Doc hit it right. You're absorbing so much more. You're out there running up and down a river, fishing 5 or 6 different rivers in a day, where that's probably highly unlikely when you get older, and there's nothing wrong with that. You might have a different enjoyment of it all at that point, but that drive when you're younger kind of sets you up for your base skill set, right? And then you look back and you're like, man, I was an animal back then.
I know. That's right.
I also think that, I know one of the comments kind of mentioned that we sounded like we were being elitist in saying that you had to start when you're young, but we're not making these comments in reference to ourselves.
No.
We're just saying, as a general principle, start as early as you can, get out as often as you can.
Yeah.
And I think if you just take that away from it, that's the heart of what we're trying to say.
For sure.
We're not the best anglers in the world. There's some kid out there at 23 that's fished way more hours than all of us have, who's kicking our butts on the river. But we're just making a point that we'd like everybody to get out there.
Sure enough.
I like to walk behind that guy with my clicker.
That was good.
Click, 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 click.
That's a nice way to wrap that up. The landscape is changing for trout anglers. No doubt you've already noticed another truck at your favorite access point and seen more anglers on the water. For those looking for new challenges and fishing opportunities, Trout Routes has the data to help you avoid the crowds and explore new public water. Trout Routes has mapped more than 50,000 trout streams across the country with curated, detailed maps of public land and access points. Trout Routes has developed integrated and interactive data, putting the tools in your hands to research new water and help you navigate in the wild to know exactly where you stand in the current. It's still up to you to find those deep pools and undercuts, but Trout Routes helps you get on the water, connecting you with resources like fly shops and stream gauges for trout water across the country. Download Trout Routes in the App Store today and visit troutroutes.com to learn more. For over a decade, Smith Creek has helped anglers just like you to free up your hands, hold your gear within easy reach, and keep our waters clean. Smith Creek's family of patented accessories are tested guide tough and backed by good old-fashioned customer service. Crafted from rugged materials like anodized marine-grade aluminum and UV-resistant nylon, Smith Creek products are hand-assembled with pride and built to last. To stay up to date on their latest specials and new product releases, be sure to follow Smith Creek on Instagram at SmithCreekNZ. Quality you can depend on from a brand you can trust. That's Smith Creek. All right, let's do a real question here. Who wants to read it? Oh, Austin Dando isn't here. He was going to read it, but here we go. Dr. Trevor Smith with reading skills.
I love reading.
Mm-hmm.
Landry Morris from New Hampshire. The Troutbitten crew had taught me a lot.
Hey,
has taught me
first
a lot?
typo from Landry. Good job, Landry.
All right. Good
Thanks,
job.
bud.
Has taught me a lot. Thank you all for making my days on the water so much more enjoyable than they used to be. I've become a big fan of your whole project. Love the style you guys teach in. It just fits the way I like to approach my days on the water. So speaking of water, the crew I fish with all go to the holes. They like to fish the pools and the slow sections, and they catch some fish. But because of what you guys recommend, I've taken to fishing faster sections in my river, often skipping the water that most people are standing in. I feel like I catch just as many fish and probably more. I think the faster water is just more fun. So am I missing good opportunities if I pass up the slower sections? Thanks, guys. Hey now.
He says, hey now.
Hey now.
Thanks, Landry.
Sometimes.
Yep, move on then.
That's it.
That's your answer. I wonder how old Landry is. Man, it doesn't.
I don't know.
Yeah, anyway. Deli, what do you have? So he says sometimes.
Sometimes. I think there's a time and place for pools that will outfish and outproduce the fast water. Winter comes to mind. Maybe hatches. I would say yes, enjoy spend time on the water in the water that you enjoy. But also, if you want to be a complete angler, spend some time in the pools to kind of find where the fish are in that bigger pool, and then maybe the strategies it takes to catch some of those.
Like Deli said, it depends. I mean, sometimes, right? I think it's all so conditional. I don't know where Landry is fishing, but if it's stocked water, they might be kind of pulled up right where if they stocked them, at the bridge hole. A lot of them might be in that bridge hole still. Depends on the water temperature, all the stuff.
Yeah, I think that's good. But I also think if you're fishing on a river where everybody's in the slow stuff and you're having success in the fast water, keep doing it.
That's
if
a
you
good
have that
answer.
water to yourself.
Yeah, and you're having fun. He says he thinks it's more fun. I do too. I told you guys I was fishing one of our favorite rivers with Dad for a couple days, and the water's up in a way that it hasn't been for a few years. I just enjoyed kind of powering through some of the heaviest water, some of my favorite stuff, and had great flows, great color, and the fish were pretty responsive for large parts of the day anyway.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think they're responsive because it's challenging. Right?
Yeah.
Regardless, it's easier to fish pools. And oftentimes I find that if it is, pocket water, it's harder to wade. It scares off a percentage of anglers. And, the hatch can bring fish in there, but oftentimes the solitude and the security of that water, I think, attracts those fish because they get pressured less.
Yeah.
If, the wading is challenging, most people don't like
That's
that
true.
type of
Yeah, I
fishing.
kind of had all that water to myself for 2 days, almost all of it. There's like maybe one other person I saw kind of wading that stuff. We've talked about it. I love that stuff. You guys do too. And I'm with you, Matt. I think not only are they less selective because maybe they see fewer anglers, but they have to make quicker decisions. They can't inspect your fly for very long because it's going by pretty quick, even down in the strike zone. So Landry, thanks for that question. Hey, there's the clicker. Let's hear it, Matt. Let me hear it. Here's the clicker.
That's crisp.
It is, right? That's the manual clicker.
We got to do that for the grievance episode instead of next.
Oh, there you go. Next
Click.
grievance. Click, click.
I'll go get mine. We can have synchronized
Oh, that's
clickers.
nice. I got one of those clickers in my desk. I'll get it out while we're talking. All right, then. Let's get to emergers. Let's talk about it. A couple of weeks ago, we did a podcast about fishing through a caddis hatch. That worked well. So let's approach this discussion in kind of a similar way. How about we begin with some thoughts on how you guys work emergers into your fishing rhythm, what you do out there every day. That will lead us through an overview of these flies and what you can do with them. Then we'll break things down with a little more detail with the different parts of the water column, where and how we fish emergers from the surface to just underneath to the mid column. We'll cover fly styles and techniques then too. First though, what do you think, guys? Do you fish this style much? Do you fish emergers very much? And how do you adapt your fishing to suit the emerging insects?
I haven't fished it much since moving. I fished it a lot more when I was back in PA, but so my emerging fishing has gotten sloppy.
So, I'm going to argue right away. Anytime there's a hatch going on, I bet you're fishing emerger styles, perhaps. You might just be thinking of one style of emerger. But all right, so Matt doesn't fish them.
Here's the type of water I spend most of my time in. So 10%, right? We'll say 10% of my fishing, probably less than that, 5%. It's, I don't need to approach those fish with an emerger because of the freestone nature of the stream, the riffly water. They just don't get that selective. And the
Interesting.
majority of the time that I'm targeting fish with the dry fly, it's less mayfly and more stonefly, hopper, terrestrial, non-emerger like activity.
Cool.
I would say is the best dry fly fishing out here. So I'm not saying you don't have it. There's plenty of rivers out here with PMDs that people people enjoy. I'm just saying it's much less dynamic, the mayfly emergences out west than back east.
Cool. So I don't know. By the end of the podcast, maybe we'll get Matt saying that he does fish emergers. But what about the rest of you guys? How does it work into your fishing rhythms?
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about this maybe a little bit last week, but through the portions of our season where the fish are seeing caddis, a lot of times my tag nymph or the upper nymph in my rig is something that could imitate an emerging caddis in shape or size or color. And it's purposeful because I think the trout are keying in on that, and they see that emerging stage as a bit of a vulnerable stage and a stage in which they probably get the best crack at eating that particular life form. So yeah, it feels like you would be leaving something on the table for me back, on our streams if you didn't
Doc,
take those into account.
Do you think though that fishing it that deep is a true emerger?
It's a good question. I mean, so I guess what I'm thinking is like from the minute the pupa like gets out of its case or its larval stage, and from then until it's on the surface, I'm thinking about it as emerging.
Okay.
But I guess that's up to definition of the term.
I was thinking of emerger. Don, you mentioned it in the write-up.
He's admitting it already.
Subsurface. I am. I just jumped to it, but I don't consider an emerger. I consider like a wet fly, like fishing a wet fly, but maybe not a dead drifted CDC bead-headed pheasant tail. Less of a emerger, but that's
you're hitting on one of the main reasons I wanted to cover it.
It's for debate,
because I do think there's a lot of confusion there. I hear people saying I was fishing emergers and they were fishing wet flies underneath. Then I hear people saying they're fishing emergers and they're fishing, the surface film really just underneath, like an inch underneath. And then I hear people saying I was fishing emergers and they're fishing a clink hammer, which is cool. I mean, all those things are really cool. So, I feel like I do all of those.
Really cool.
So I guess my definition, of an emerger would be the transition between nymph to adult insect.
Yeah.
Because
right on. There's a lot there.
So
too.
there's a big, stages. Caddis, like we talked about, have the pupa stage, but for the most part, we're talking about, a nymph or a larva transitioning to the dry fly or the adult male or female. And so I guess that's
caddis
the quote emergence of that insect, right?
Caddis, mayflies, midges, or stoneflies.
It's coming out from under the rock.
They do something different. They crawl out, but still, there's an emergence there. I think 20 years ago, when I first heard the term, and maybe again, it's just my frame of reference, I believed early on then it's a dry fly that's stuck in the film. And boy, now we hear emerger referred to in all these different ways we're talking. Anybody else want to kind of high level this before we jump into it?
I guess almost every major hatch, for the most part, I'll carry some sort of emerger. For me, it seems like they're more prevalent in those lower temperature days. Maybe they get stuck in that emergence phase more in a longer period. I don't know. Maybe it's 3 seconds. Maybe it expands to like 5 seconds. I don't know. But I guess what I've kind of experienced is that, let's say the sulfurs hatch and the temperature is like 45 to like 55. It's colder than what you would expect. And so during those periods, I noticed that the emergers will fish better. And so that's kind of what has led me to always be prepared to fish emergers.
Right on.
This time of year, I have kind of two go-to patterns at this time of year in particular. I just fish a lot more, and they don't do as well the rest of the year, and they do really well right about now. And that's more of the style that Mr. Trevor over there was talking about. I'll say this, and we'll get more into it, but when I think about fishing emergers, I think about the fact that almost all of my dry flies, like I very rarely fish for flies that are representative of that like final transformation where they're drying their wings or something. You know what I mean? Like almost all of my dry flies I tie to hold a little bit more water, just because it's just so much more often that I see fish coming up to the top and I don't see the fly that they're going after. And so I've just always done that. All of my dry flies just sit a little lower.
So let's jump right into that. I think we're all saying that we all think of emergers right off the bat as topwater emergers. So again, let's do topwater, and then the ones that are kind of stuck in the surface film or just underneath. And I'm going to argue that that's different than topwater. And then mid-column, which is kind of a nymph that's on its way up, let's say. I like what Bill said, that emergence, of course, happens from the time it decides, okay, I'm not going to be a nymph anymore. I'm going to go up top and be a dry fly. We covered this in the caddis podcast, but that whole process, there are stages of that process. On its way up, it is emerging. We can just use a regular nymph even to look like an emerger in the middle. But anyway, we'll get to that part. Let's start with start with topwater. The dry fly with parts of the fly underneath. That's what I think.
Right, yeah. That's what I was going to say. I think the definition of that for me is that there's part of the fly in both parts of that water column. We talked about this with the mouse emerger a little bit, that there's the front of the fly above the water, back of the fly below, right? And yeah, so I mean, most of the dry flies that I fish hatches with, I think sort of set up this way a little bit. I like the clink hammer a lot, and I like the sparkle dun a lot. Just because it sits in, and I don't know. I also, with a lot of more maybe traditional hackled flies, dry flies that I've had over the years, I end up trimming with like my clippers off the underside of
them riding lower.
The hackle, right? Yeah, just so it rides flat, and eventually, as you fish it, it'll start to, the back end often will start to dip under. But it's pretty rare that I don't use, I guess, a bit of a emerger type pattern for the hatches.
Me too.
It's kind of my
The longer I fish, the more I fish sort of these emerger dry flies. There's nothing, that crazy about them. I mean, they're very common now, right? Whereas the traditional Adams or the Catskill style dry fly used to be the thing. That's not an emerger. Now a lot of people are using clink hammers, and there are elements of an emerger with the sparkle dun. The sparkle dun has that trailing shuck, right? Well, is it Antron? I think it's Antron.
Yeah. Or Zelon, or any of the, whatever. Right? Any of the lawns.
So it has that, anyway, it has that shuck that's kind of stuck in the water. But especially the clink hammer, I think is, or a snowshoe emerger. And I use Wyatt's deer hair emerger. That was probably before the clink hammer for me. All of those are on a curved hook, so you get a part of the fly that is actually underneath the water. And like you said, Trevor, then of course the parachute or whatever, the wing on the deer hair is up above. And those are almost all of my favorite dry flies. Yeah.
Dom, is it safe to say that you're fooling fish, this is a question, that are clearly eating adults on the water and still fooling them with that emerger, which is why you use that?
Yeah, lots of times. Yeah, I feel like they'll eat if they're clearly eating adults, as you say, I can still throw the clink hammer at them and they go, oh, I'll take that too. That's easier. I find it rare for them to be so selective that they're going to go, nope, not eating that. That's too easy. That's partially stuck in the film. No thanks. I just have gone to those. I wanted to ask you guys this, but the CDC and elk, you guys use that?
I use it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For me, all that CDC laying on the water, especially when it's wet. Think about it when it's wet, not after you just dusted it up. But when it's wet, for me, it kind of has the same thing. You have some of that CDC fluff under the water then. Whereas, of course, the deer hair or the elk hair, whichever, is up above the water. And for me, that's even an emerger concept. And it's become another one of my favorites, just my go-tos.
Yeah.
I do think that there's like a visual element to whether it is completely broken the surface tension or not.
Yeah.
Like I think that it's easier for them to spot. It's easier for them I think that a lot of times when they're eating the adult, they've known the adult was there. They saw it get out of that surface tension. They know where it's at. You ever swimming and look up from underwater and see how much easier it is to see something that is partially submerged than it is to see if it's actually on top of the water? I just think that it's way more approachable. It's a lot easier to see.
Oak and Oscar is an American watch company that does things the right way, not the easy way, crafting mechanical timepieces that combine Swiss precision with American know-how. Oak and Oscar was founded in 2015, named after the owner's love of bourbon and his dog Oscar. Their watches are built to withstand even the most adventurous fly angler. Our very own Austin Dando has been putting his homestead to the test since last year. Oak and Oscar is a watch company that loves fly fishing. Visit their website at oakandoscar.com/troutbitten. Mark your time on the water with Oak and Oscar. So Matt, you asked if if I feel like I can fool trout that are feeding clearly on the adults with the emerger. What about the other way around then? If you're not fishing emerger styles too much, what about the other way? If you find that they're kind of touchy about coming all the way to the surface, can you get them with the full surface pattern?
I mean, I have. I definitely,
I'm sure, yeah,
at times carry both. But if they're like, and I vividly remember, one of your guys' favorite spring creeks in March, at 12 o'clock, where you had a classic catskill tie that would destroy fish constantly. And you knew they were on the dun, so that's what you would target. This is just my experience. When the fish got more challenging is when I'd always go towards the snowshoe bunny fly, which for me was my go-to emerger. And anytime I did a quick switch, and that little switch would change it, and we always would say, oh, they're hitting emergers.
Nice.
Were they? I don't know.
Yeah, right. Who knows? That one ate it.
Yeah.
And then his buddy did.
That seemed to be the trick. And, all these, I would, do you guys see a particular hatch, the emergers for a specific species works better than what I kind of just said, the early season blue wings, or is it across the board? They shed the exoskeleton at the same time, and don't hang in the water every species of bugs? Or is it kind of what Deli said? Does the weather dictate it, or does the species or some species lazier at shedding that exoskeleton? Do you see any difference?
Man, that's a good question. Yeah.
I do think the weather and maybe the water temperature plays a role in it. The two hatches that stand out as far as real emerger hatches to me are the caddis and then also slate drakes, because slate drakes are different because slate drakes, if you ever caught one of the nymphs, they swim like a minnow, and so they
crawl out too.
They'll crawl out, but they'll swim. Like you can see, like on bigger river systems, you see fish, or I've seen fish breach more often. I'll often, whatever that emerger is that I have tied on the back of the dry fly, if I'm fishing dry dropper, like I'm mending it, I'm doing different things, and like just the erratic movement seems to trigger fish more often. And sometimes it's like a way better tactic than trying to just nymph fish during that hatch.
I said earlier, more often now I'm using, I'd say, emerger styles. Matt, talking about fishing over specific hatches, I kind of use 3 or 4 different dry fly patterns regardless of the hatch. And that's just me. So I use a clink, let's say it's a mayfly hatch. I'm thinking clink hammer, a parachute, a standard parachute. When they seem to get picky, then I used to go comparadun, regular comparadun. And now I've been going CDC comparadun. And man, the way that rides, the CDC stays nice on the surface. If you dust it up, right? You got a nice puff of CDC there. But that body's kind of in the surface. Again, I don't know if you could fairly call it an emerger, but it has like emerger properties to it, right? That body is low in the water with that CDC emerger.
Sure.
I hardly ever use a catskill style pattern anymore. I don't use high riding flies very much. Even when it comes to caddis, I don't use a elk hair caddis too much compared to how I used to, right? So it's, for me, if I have the flies at my box, it's much more often an X caddis or CDC and elk, especially that CDC and elk. I just do better. I just get better response.
Yeah. When it's interesting, because I end up tying more buoyant out here and more visible just because of the broken water. And it's the particular waters I'm fishing,
sure,
right? They're all very fast. There's not many pools, right? So you got to be able to see that fly. And if you're in a boat, right, you're not looking at a, clink hammer that isn't visible. You're sacrificing that for a more buoyant fly. So, it's interesting. And I used to be in your shoes, right? Where I remember thinking about all this. Like, why the hell wasn't I getting these trout to eat my catskill tie, and then develop this emerger approach? So it's just interesting.
That's cool. You're saying you're basically doing it for yourself more than for the fish. Like you don't need to do it for the fish. You're doing it for yourself for more for buoyancy and visibility. And so you can keep fishing.
Yeah, and the approach is different.
Matt, you guys don't have the hatches that we do kind of in the East here. Like I mean, you have some hatches, but like the mayflies don't have the same type of emergence cycle that we do. Is that a fair statement? In some of the rivers?
In some of them, but I think there's just a lot of, we could go down rabbit holes here. We don't have everyone standing in the hole really getting after these fish. You're in a boat, and those fish don't see nearly the flies, and I think that has something to play into it. You don't get the epic spinner falls. You're spot on with that.
So they don't all fall at once.
A PMD is one of the big mayfly hatches. The blueing olive is a major mayfly hatch. We get some western green drakes, some March browns, but you don't have the layers upon layers of all the other mayflies in the abundance. Right? I've never seen I've seen thick blue wing hatches and some thick PMD hatches, but nothing like back in Central PA in May, man. That's legendary hatches there.
Matt just added like 15 people to the water. Thanks a lot, bud.
Sorry, man.
Way to go, Matt. Way to burn it down.
You should be proud of that. It's pretty freaking cool, man. I said, if you want to go see bugs, get to go to Central PA and see a smorgasbord of a lot of cool bugs.
Come on, man. There's 20 people.
Yeah. But I think to his point though, like it is a destination.
2 more.
And so it does get more pressure. And so I do think, like Dom, what you're saying, like I don't fish Catskill patterns hardly ever anymore.
I used to. I fish them in small streams. Do you small streams?
No. Mostly just fish caddis there. But for the most part, I fish a comparadun. One thing I didn't realize when I first started fishing was when I'm putting like floating, whether it be gink or whatever on it, I only, when I first started, I was like, I better soak this whole fly in it because I want the fly to float. But like, if you truly want it to be an emerger and want it to ride better, like, I'm only putting floating on the wing.
Good point.
Of that comparadun, so that it is, like you're saying, kind of riding in the surface film.
Yeah, because I want that effect underneath. I want them to see something underneath. So yeah, don't put floating on it.
How often do you do that, Del? Like, do you find yourself submerging it in the surface film from March to end of May? Or is it just when shit hits the fan in May and the pressure's high?
Pretty much every hatch I fish a comparadun for.
Yeah, I know you do.
I can put like white elk hair in as my comparadun. I can add kind of like your widow's web type material and add a little bit of like sparkle or something for the bigger rivers that have horrible glare. You can see it better. I don't know. The traditional Catskill, I guess for me, has fallen out of favor. I'm sure it still works, and I'm sure it still fishes well in certain circumstances, but it's cheaper and it's easier to tie the comparadun. It's not as pretty as a Catskill.
For me. Got to give them that. They're pretty.
No, it doesn't look as pretty, but
it is quicker to tie. Matt, all these flies I'm talking about, they all float really well. I'd say when it comes to CDC, I got to baby it, and that doesn't necessarily float really well, especially when I catch all those fish and then it gets all slimed up. I got to slow down. I say I don't catch so many fish, Dom. Come on. Hey, look, I got mine. I told you there's mine. That's my old clicker. I'm gonna bring my clicker. I'm gonna use a zip tie, Josh, and I'm gonna zip tie it to my vest, and I'm gonna.
One of these days, I'm gonna fly home, and I'm gonna mess around with all of you.
So I use a clink hammer a lot for a dry dropper, and on those ones, I'll put like 8 wraps of hackle, and a little bit beefier of a parachute post. I use parachute post made out of macrame yarn, and so that stuff floats. And so I get a lot of buoyancy out of my clink hammers. I can fish some rough water. They're buoyant.
Yeah, they are.
Not all the emerger styles are, though. Sort of the next level down then is actually, it's not far. Let's talk about being in the surface film or just
like
under
half an inch.
Yeah, like a half inch. Or, I don't know, Del, how far do we want to go to still call it like that?
The film.
Yeah. Well, I'll even say like 6 inches down. Let's say 6 inches down. I know that's not surface film, but I'm saying surface film or just underneath is kind of its own level. No longer is it a dry fly, but it looks like a bug that is helpless or kind of stuck in a film.
I guess at this point, it's closer to the adult than to the nymph, right? you're kind of in that transition phase where it's like half adult, half nymph at that point.
Yeah. And so that is different than just being a dry fly. Like for me, I usually just use wet flies for that. I don't get real picky about these flies, but let's talk about it. What do you guys do?
The one that comes to mind that I run into is like a sulfur. And so I'll tie like basically a pheasant tail of half of the body, and then the head will basically be the same type of material I would try a sulfur dry on, but I'll put like a little poof of like CDC, not enough to make it float, but kind of hang in that top inch or two. I hit a sulfur hatch, and this is kind of, I guess, what taught me about emergers.
Yeah.
And there were just fish rising, what I thought was rising, but all I could see was their backs. And right so on. I guess when they're in that kind of, we're talking about like that top, let's say, like you're saying, top 6 inches of the water column.
Sure.
And you're not seeing heads come out of the water. You're seeing like the dorsal fin come out of the water.
Yeah.
That means they're probably keying on that emergence of that like transition phase. I've kind of taken that same pattern and tied it for all the hatches now, where it's half pheasant tail, half whatever dry fly colors that you choose to tie for your hatch, with a little bit of like wing or something out of it.
So that wing maybe looks like legs and part of a trailing or part of a shock or something, kind of a mess.
Yeah.
I always think like, I want to take a regular nymph and then make it look messy, which is what a wet fly is. Some of them.
So do you guys ever see, I always feel like this is one of the times I get stumped. I get stumped all the time, but this one in particular, like I could leave not clicking, right? Like fake clicking, and walk through the woods with my head down, because oftentimes, Bill, you're talking about this fish and you see its back. Do you also see those adults? We all know what the adults are, the sailboats, right? So you guys have complexity, right?
Mayflies.
You could have a gray fox hatch and then, a Hendrickson and
right now,
whatever it may be, March Browns. You have a smorgasbord of stuff going on. So it's hard to identify, that's frustrating to me at times because it's hard. And I know guys that are really good at it, at evaluating it, putting the emerger on, and then they start smoking fish. Because that's a whole other part to this, right? Like with all the other bugs going on, you got to be able to identify what it could be, what they're eating on.
Yeah.
And then each fish can be different.
Right.
Yeah. To Dom's point, I've seen where one fish in a pool is eating one and one fish in a pool is eating another. But to me, it's like the rise forms that you can sometimes tell. Like if you want to, quote, headhunt and look for the bigger fish, like a lot of times there is a lot of value in like, hey, watch that fish rise 3 or 4 times and try to get an idea. Maybe you can see the bug he's eating. If you can't see the bug he's eating, then, maybe it's something really small. Or if you see his back occasionally, maybe he's on emergers. But yeah, there are nights when you have spinners that dump in the riffles and are coming through the pools. You have duns that are out, and then you have emergers. And then you have crane flies, and then you have, 3 other insects that are also potentially on the water at that time.
Yeah.
It's a puzzle, and it's a fun puzzle.
Yeah. And I feel like they do change over, and maybe it is individual per fish, but a lot of times the majority of the fish change what they're eating at a certain point in that evening. Right.
Do you ever envy the angler that get that one when it's like that and you just hear the hoot and holler? For that one fish, right? It's like they cracked the code, they figured it out, and that like made their night. You don't envy that person? I kind of envy them.
No. Well, all right. My buddy Rich, he's passed away. I've told you all about Rich. But anyway, I always used to bust his balls because he would sit in the kind of situation we're talking about, right? And there would be more rises for him to target. He would find one fish. It didn't matter if it was 10 inches. He was like, I'm catching it. I'm catching that fish. And then he'd finally catch it, Matt. Like after, 45 minutes of changing patterns and then resting the fish and smoking that cigar a little bit. And he'd finally catch it and he would hoot and holler. Yeah. He goes, I got him on PMD emerger or whatever. And I go, bullshit. Like you finally got lucky. You finally snagged him in the head.
There's probably something to learn.
That's right. You finally, come on. There. What did you learn from that one fish? There's something to be learned.
Yeah.
Right.
But what are the rest of the fish doing? He didn't learn that. To Trevor's point, I'm trying to find what the majority of the fish are doing. Honestly, after knowing Rich and fishing with him and having such great trips with him and seeing how successful he was and the kind of enjoyment he got out of that, I like to do that once in a while. I'll find out one fish that's being stubborn and I'll go, all right, I'll be stubborn too. And I'll get you, and when you finally do, I often wonder though, did another fish move in like right beside him? And he's like, I'll take it on the first time he sees the 10th fly put in there. He's like, I'll eat
Hold
that.
my beer.
And he's looking at his buddy like, what are you doing? I'll get it.
Yeah.
Whether it's after a fishing trip or at a backyard fire, you can bet the Troutbitten crew has a case of New Trail Broken Heels along with us. It's honestly our favorite beer. This hazy IPA is smooth and full-bodied. Hand-selected Citra hops lead to notes of bright clementine and juicy ruby red grapefruit. Broken Heels is a keeper. New Trail beer is proudly brewed in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and delivered cold to your favorite craft beer retailer every week. At New Trail, it's not about being the best angler. It's about getting out there. So enjoy nature's moments and reward yourself for a day well fished with New Trail Broken Heels. It's Troutbitten's favorite beer. Precision Fly and Tackle is a family-owned business with a passion for the outdoors and a sense of adventure. They are anglers who enjoy every moment spent on the water with family and friends. Precision Fly and Tackle carries the widest selection of Euro rods, reels, lines, leaders, flies, and accessories. From the beginner to the advanced angler, Precision Fly and Tackle can outfit every angler, no matter the budget. Visit them online at precisionflyandtackle.com. Then use code TROUTBITTEN10, that's the number 10, for 10% off your order. Gear up with Precision Fly and Tackle for your next adventure.
I had one of those fish last year that there were caddis all over the water, but their blue quills had started to hatch. And so I had switched over and there was caddis all over the water, but I was fishing a small, like 18 comparadun. And I watched this fish rise for a while and finally, whether timed it right or had the right fly on and it caught it. And it was like the first whiskey I caught in central PA on a dry fly.
No kidding.
And I was like, okay, cool. To your point, like there are times where if you can scope that fish out and spend the time, it does pay. But there are other times where you spend all that time on that one fish to figure it out, and he turns out to be like you're saying, like a 10-inch fish or whatever. But it's still, I don't know. There's enjoyment in that, in all of it.
Well, and sometimes you can't move, right? Because you're there's a guy above you, a guy below you, and there's 8 trout rising in front of you, and that's okay. Like I see where you gotta rotate
that's
through
fair
patterns too. And emergers and all that fun stuff. There's situational stuff.
Let me ask you guys though, if we're talking about emergers that are just under the surface, maybe that's 6 inches. 6 inches might be generous. So let's say 3 inches under the surface and in the surface film too. What are your patterns and like how would you fish them? Maybe that's even more important. We already mentioned a couple patterns. How do you fish them? How do you keep them in that 3 inches of water very near the surface?
I fish them typically in tandem, with a more buoyant dry fly. And I honestly partially do that just because I do have trouble detecting the take sometimes if I don't. But I also like to reliably get the fly within that zone that I want. Just the connection of tippet between the two flies tends to keep it there. And so I'll keep that a pretty short connection, typically like 6 to 8 inches, I'd say. And I'll fish them like that in tandem. But that honestly is the only way I do the just underneath the surface type.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm like Trevor, dry dropper style. Nymph has no weight to it.
Right.
Or whatever emerger or whatever pattern, probably 6 to 10 inches as far as like the amount of tippet between the two. Because the closer it is, the easier it is to detect the strike and to keep it in that same seam. I'll fish kind of unweighted nymphs in this phase too.
Sure.
Same,
like this, like sulfurs, for example. Like I have just a standard sulfur nymph that I fish a lot that's unweighted, has some Indian hen for the legs. And so there's been some times that's been really effective.
Yeah.
When I was in Indiana, PA, I knew a fisherman. I never fished with him, but we talked about fishing a lot. And he fished wet flies a lot. And he would fish a single wet just a single wet, almost like he would a dry fly, but it was unweighted. And he would fish it basically on a dry fly leader and just right under the surface. I'm like, how do you see the takes? He's like, you don't, but you feel it, or you see some disturbance, or you set. I tried it, and I have since tried it, since I think I've become a better fit. This is like 25 years ago. He had something that I'm not able to do. You guys ever do that? Just maybe even a pair of wets, or just try to keep them, no dry fly, a wet fly right underneath.
I don't know if I specifically do a wet fly, Dom, but I've done like LaFontaine sparkle pupas.
Right
and
on.
then I will strip it very slowly, like a streamer, to keep the tension, to feel the take, like he's kind of talking about.
Yeah.
And I've had success with that. I've had success. And when I say, limited, but there's been that 1 or 2 times where I'm soft stripping a LaFontaine caddis pupa, whether it's the movement, the depth, I don't know what it is, but it all seems to click.
That's cool.
That's a good pattern to acknowledge. And during the caddis podcast, we talked about the deep sparkle pupa and the emerging sparkle pupa. I've fished both of them. They both have antron. Well, they're both emergers, right? Are they both emergers? Is that deep sparkle pupa actually an emerger? That's kind of the next question if we move into that next phase.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing I'll say is like the wet fly thing. When I first started fly fishing and I started fishing hatches, I wasn't the best at presenting things on the surface and the dead drift and all that. And so the wet flies I had a little more success with that during hatches,
right?
Because it was, I won't say idiot proof, because there's a lot to swinging flies, but it was, if you throw it at a 45 and you let it swing through the water column, you have tension, you can feel the hit, you can,
a lot of things in your favor.
Yeah. I felt like that helped me a lot starting.
That tactic's kind of something night fishing's helped with. 1, because you're blind, and 2, because you focus so much on just keeping the flies near the surface and you can't see it.
Yeah,
and so you just kind of learn how much tension do I need to have on this without causing a tremendous amount of drag, but how much tension do I need to keep on the flies to keep them near the surface?
Yeah.
And it starts to become a little bit subconscious, especially because you can't see. And I think that translates really well into this.
Night fishing actually really helps a lot of fishing skills. You also learn to wade without ever having to look down at your feet, because it wouldn't help anyway, right? Is it proprioception? What do you call that, Trevor?
Proprioception.
Proprioception?
Yeah.
Why don't you just say spatial awareness?
Spatial awareness is good. Proprioception is really mostly referring to your body's awareness of its own position in space.
Like that other sense.
Yeah. Like where's my foot, even when I'm not looking at it. So we have.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I never fished wet flies too much. I'd goof around and I'd have some success, not a whole lot. And when I started night fishing, I decided I need to learn to fish wet flies. I didn't have the skills. So I started to do it in the daytime a lot so that I would be able to take it over to the night game. And yeah, they kind of helped. That helped in the day. And then they're doing it a lot at night has helped my wet fly fishing in the day too. So for me, I think that wet fly fishing often is simulating an emerging insect. So it's kind of an emerger. Many times when you're fishing wet flies, if you're even just doing the traditional wet fly swing, you're fishing an emergence. There might not even be an emergence going on, but it perhaps looks like something they're very familiar with. And I think you're kind of fishing an emerger style anyway. I would argue that. Trevor, I know you're on my team there.
Yeah, absolutely.
What if we move below that surface film then, that 3 inches, 6 inches, or the actual stuck in the surface film? What if we go down to mid-column emergers? Again, this is where we might have some perhaps disagreement.
You're nymphing. Just call it what it is.
That's right. You might be just nymphing. I like it. So Matt, talk about it, man. Like, why is it just nymphing? If I'm throwing something down in there in the mid-column, they're eating my tag, or they're eating 12 inches, 16 inches off the bottom, not an emerger?
I don't think that is, in my opinion, an emerger is more of if you're swinging that tag at the end and you're getting a lot of hits.
Ooh, nice.
Then I'm like, all right, well, I'm presenting that as an emerging, insect. That makes a lot of sense.
Well, I like that. What if so you're putting some motion on it?
Yeah.
What if I speed lead it? What if I lift it up, like do the induced take, the Sawyer's induced take? I kind of lift it with the
I would say
current.
that's absolutely, enticing fish to eat because they're seeing that in the water column at a specific time of year, 100%. But I just, I often, catch my fish on the, if it's on the dead drift and I'm fishing a CDC pheasant tail, with a fairly big bead on it, I'm like, I don't know what that looks like, but it's a nymph. They're eating it as a nymph, right? But it's a cool discussion.
So is there a difference between the nymph ride, let's say you're tight lining something and you're fishing it off the tag, versus if you're fishing something dry dropper? Let's say they're both riding in that same seam. Let's say they're both a foot under the surface.
In 2 feet of water, maybe.
Yeah, in 2 feet of water.
Yeah.
Do you think one, I guess, fishes differently than the other?
Not in the same depth of water. I don't know. I find that if I'm fishing dry dropper, oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes it's riding much higher than what my tag nymph rig would be like, and so at that point, I would argue in that situation, and I do it many times from the boat, that most fish are hitting it as an emerger, but I only have 2.5 feet of tippet or 2 feet of tippet off the, chubby or whatever I'm fishing.
Yeah.
I just feel like if I'm fishing it as a nymph, or on a contact rig, I have a lot more control over what I end up doing. And so rather than having to adjust my tippet back and forth, I can just adjust the depth pretty easily. And if I do feel like that's something that I'm interested in doing, I feel like it's easier to dial in maybe what depth they're looking at, if I'm using a contact rig versus doing a dry dropper style for it. Not that I can't clip and retie and all that, but I'd prefer to be fishing it, I think, a contact rig if I had the option.
I don't know if I have a preference, but Bill, I love this question because I think a lot about what the flies are actually looking like down there. And you could put it in a dry dropper scenario, and that same fly that's basically mid-column, or like equal mid-column we're talking about, 1 foot down in 2 feet of water, it's going to, under a dry fly, go natural speed, let's say. Natural current, mid-current, let's say mid-current speed. But if I put it in a contact rig, tight line nymphing rig, and let's say I have it as the tag, like we're talking about, and let's say I take that point fly and I get low enough to even touch the bottom, then I'm using the bottom to slow the whole rig down. Maybe I don't even touch the bottom, but I just get the strike zone. I get a hold of the strike zone, which is going slower. Anyway, I'm using the point fly to slow everything down a little bit. Now, what that tag fly is doing is a slower thing. The speed it's going is slower than the actual mid-column that it's in. And I think that looks pretty neat. I think the fish sometimes do too. But anyway, you don't need to get too far into the weeds about that. But it is I would argue it's a very different look, or it can be a very different look, certainly a different speed than under a dry dropper. And if I'm touching the bottom, I can even get that tick to tick of the bottom. And then every time I touch the bottom, then the tag fly is ticking or bumping a little bit too. Yeah. Different things. And there I think maybe with that motion, like you're saying, Matt, that could be thought of or seen as an emerger.
I guess to me, the tight line rig, I feel like you are putting more influence on that fly.
Sure.
And it's also kind of fixed, right? Let's say you have a 5-inch tag off of there. It only has like that 5 inches of movement, let's say, with your point fly, versus that dry dropper rig. Let's say you're fishing a brass bead. And so that brass bead, I think, has a little bit more movement that may look just a hair more natural at times.
Because it's lighter.
And so with that nymph rig, I almost think of it as like you're pegging it at a location in the water column, where like the dry dropper that's in that column, maybe it's a little bit more buoyant and it's acting more natural, maybe.
I like it. I'm with all that. So it might be a nymph, it might be an emergence. I'm not sure it matters what we call it, but it's the concepts I think are always good to think around. So what do we miss, guys? Anything else?
I think that mid-column emerger,
okay.
I think caddis and slate drakes, that because they both kind of have, they're more
athletic bugs. I always say that.
Yeah, like if you
can move more, right?
Yeah, if you pick up a slate drake and put it in your hand with some water, it'll swim around like a minnow.
They have all those feathery legs on the sides.
Yep.
Locomotion. Feels like to simplify the debate over what is and what isn't an emerger. I feel like if we just say, if we're changing something that is more effective because or during a hatch, that has to make it like in the emerger category. Like if we're leaving what we would normally do, if we're tying a different fly on that we don't normally use in that instance, if we're adding more motion than we normally would, then like that, to me, that becomes an emerger because we are changing something. We're leaving the norm because there's activity, hatch activity, and we're trying to imitate it.
Can I complicate things?
Go ahead.
So have you ever, we've all experienced blanket hatches, right?
Yeah.
So how many times could you see happening that the adults are sunken and they're clearly not emergers, right? But they sink. So there's a buttload of adults that are sunken 3 inches below the water.
Yeah.
And fish are crushing them. But they're not emergers.
They're demergers.
It's a what is that?
That's good. Demerging.
You got a fly pattern for that?
The new pattern, the demerger.
Get a hold of that one.
You just broke the internet.
Figured out how to do that.
It's a re-emerger. It's a demerger.
That's a wet fly, right? You got the wings on it. You got the bot. If you tie the wet fly that looks like the adult.
Man, I've seen all these new, I see sunken ants, and I know that's a terrestrial, but I've seen sunken, salmon flies.
Demerging ants.
Sunken whatever. But they call them sunken adults.
Count them up.
I would say that's right? Sunken adults.
Yep.
So, sunken adults. So is there a sunken adult sulfur pattern with a brass bead?
Oh, baby.
Or is it just an emerger?
Demerger.
How sunken is it?
Good.
Next podcast.
Sunken adult. Mm-hmm.
All right. There it is. So like anything else in fishing, you can take the emerger concept just about as far as you want to and get technical. Or you can spin up a couple wet flies, float them in the film, and keep things simple too. I've often argued that you don't have to match the hatch when fly fishing. I think it's a fun approach, but having exactly the right shade of dubbing to match the most prevalent insect is rarely necessary. Most often, you can fish caddis imitations during a mayfly hatch and do pretty well, because there's a lot more food in a river than what our eyes see at the surface. But we don't ignore the hatches either, far from it. In fact, we look forward to these events, anticipating the response from the trout, observing their behaviors day to day, and often using flies and tactics that imitate the emergence. From the bottom to the top, when the bugs transform from waterborne to airborne, meeting them with an emerger often sells the presentation. All right, my friends out there, thanks for listening, and thank you for being part of this Troutbitten community. Next week, the guys and I have a good discussion about boating and fishing, how floating down a river changes everything. Mr. Josh Darling, will you read us out?
Remember, the Troutbitten Project is a free resource for all anglers. The Troutbitten website hosts over 1,000 articles with endless stories, commentaries, tactics, tips, and more. Find what you like through the top menu and through the search page. Navigate by way of the categories and tags too. Be sure to find the Troutbitten YouTube channel now featuring the Troutbitten Tip Series, the Fish and Film Series, and the Troutbitten Flybox, all in collaboration with Wilds Media. Thank you for listening to the Troutbitten Podcast. Please give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a comment because that really helps. Until next time, friends, fish hard, enjoy the day, find your life on the water.
I got a green weenie emerger on.
Green weenie. I got a mop emerger.
That's good. I mean, that's technical. Just got the old clicker, man.
Gosh.
Mental plasticity.
I like to walk behind that guy with my clicker.
That was good.
Click, 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 click. I don't know what it is, but it all seems to click.